Today we're learning how to do shaping in brioche stitch. We're going to learn the basic decreases and increases that you'd use whenever you're working any kind of shaping in brioche stitch. And before I show you the decreases and increases, I just want to talk a little bit about what makes brioche stitch shaping different from shaping in regular knitting. Brioche stitches functions more or less like a 1x1 rib. You see the knit columns and the purl columns, and it's always a divisible of 2 stitches, a 2-stitch repeat all the way around. And the big thing to be aware of with brioche shaping is that we're always working in paired decreases and paired increases. So those are also known as double increases or double decreases. So rather than working, we're going to be working right-leaning decreases, left-leaning decreases, and double increases here in the center of this swatch that I'm demoing on. And rather than in regular knitting when you're often shaping with a single decrease, like a knit 2 together or a slip-slip knit, in brioche you're always doing it in pairs. So the reason for that is you always want your live stitches to be in a knit purl relationship. If you had a fabric that was knit purl all the way across and you worked a single decrease, you would have a point in your fabric where you'd have 2 knit stitches. If I was working across knit purl, and I did a decrease here where this knit decreased this purl, I'd end up with a knit stitch and a knit stitch next to each other after that point, which would then throw off my brioche stitch patterning in the following rounds. So one of the things you always want to make sure you're doing in brioche stitch to make your life a whole lot easier is always work your decreases as double decreases and your increases as double increases. You can see if I just spread out my fabric here, for example, I've got 1 knit stitch column, 1 knit stitch column, 1 knit stitch column here, and then the 2 purls in between. You can see I work an increase. This, if we follow this stitch up, it splits off into 2. So this is increasing from 1 stitch to 3. 1, 2, and 3. That's the purl stitch here in between, and the 2 knit stitches. And that way, as we've worked this increase, we've maintained this relationship of knit purl all the way across the fabric, and that's really, really key. So I wanted to make sure you understand that before we start, that you're always working double decreases and double increases to maintain pattern. And shaping in brioche is really, really fun. As you can see, you can do really interesting things playing with line work. Along this side of my work, you can see here, here, and here, I have right-leaning decreases. The decreases lean right, and over here, they're mirrored, they're leaning left. And so this symbol in my swatch, or in my diagram, shows those right-leaning, what we call brioche knit 3 together. It's easier for me to call it a right-leaning brioche decrease or a left-leaning brioche decrease. You'll also see the left-leaning called BRSSSK. Both of these types of decreases get rid of 2 stitches at once. And you'll notice that I'm working these regularly on either side, but I have this piece of fabric that's totally straight. So obviously if I'm working double decreases, in this case about every 6 pairs of rows in this case, my fabric would be shaping in if I wasn't compensating for those decreases by adding stitches as well. So what I've done to keep this nice, easy, straight piece of knitting for demo today is for every time I'm working a right-leaning decrease, I'm working a corresponding double increase. So the stitches that I'm decreasing out here, I'm increasing here in the same row. So you can think of these double increases as paired with these double decreases in order to keep my stitch count consistent. In other words, we've got little pairs of shaping techniques here. And that's what's going on. For every right leaning, I have a corresponding increase, and for every left leaning, I have a corresponding increase all the way up. And you get this pretty cool looking chevron shape. So it's just thousands of ways you can combine brioche decreases and increases to make really, really interesting dimensionality and directional motifs in your fabric. So what we're going to do first is the right-leaning decrease. I'm going to work across, I actually am on a shaping row now. I've knit to the next shaping row. So I'm going to work a double decrease, 2 double increases. You see every time I work double increases there in pairs because they're both corresponding to the decreases on either side. So we're going to do a right-leaning brioche decrease first, right here, and I'll work my way over. If you have never done brioche stitch before, we have a brioche knitting tutorial that we'll link in the notes below the video. This is kind of a 201 level demonstration, but it's going to be a lot easier for you to understand if you get the basics of brioche first. So here I am at the place where I'm going to work a double decrease. You can see that this column is where I'm centering all of my decreases. I have this dotted orange line to indicate that this is basically over one column or my fourth stitch in my row. So what I'm going to do is work this double decrease. So it's going to, this stitch, and this stitch, all three of these are going to come together into one, and I'll be decreasing out these two stitches. And then I'm going to work across, and when I get to this column here, or this stitch, I'm going to double increase to account for these two stitches, meaning I'm going to make 3 out of this single stitch to account for the 2 that I've gotten rid of here, and vice versa on the other side. So the first one we're doing is a brioche K3 tog, or a right-leaning. And so the way that you do this, see I've slipped that last stitch in my row, and I'll be making a yarn over on it as I work. So the way that you do this is you're going to go through the first 2 stitches like a regular knit 2 together. Note that this first stitch is a stitch pair. It's got a yarn over from the row below. So I'm actually going through what looks like 3 stitches, or at least 3 strands of yarn. So I'm knitting these 2 stitches together. And note that as I do, I'm creating a yarn over from the stitch that I slipped just before. So knit those 2 stitches together. So I've gotten rid of one of the 2 stitches that I want to decrease. Now that I've knit those 2 stitches together, I'm going to slide that stitch that I just made back over to my left needle. You can see my working yarns coming off of the stitch on my left needle. And I'm going to go into this stitch like that, both the stitch and its corresponding yarn over. And I'm going to bring those over top of the new stitch that I just made, like that. Like that. And I'm going to slip that stitch back over to my right. So now you can see my working yarns coming off. And I've got 1, 2, 3 columns of stitches going into that single stitch that I just made. And that's the right leaning decrease, brioche knit 3 together. So I'm going to work across in brioche until I hit my increase point. Okay, and here I am now at the stitch that I'm going to work a double increase in, just to remind you. We worked that, we've worked across, and now we're working this guy here. And same way that we decreased 2, we're going to increase 2 here. Double increase is really easy in brioche stitch. So I'm going to go into that stitch and its corresponding yarn over. Normally, note that I'm creating a yarn over here in the slip stitch on my right needle. So I'm going in to do the increase. I do a regular brioche knit normally, come out, but I don't slide these stitches off my right needle yet. Then I'm going to yarn over, so bring my yarn to the front, and I'm going to go back into that exact same stitch and knit it again. So I basically did a knit, yarn over, knit right into the same stitch. If we follow this column of stitches up, you've got 3 stitches coming out of it. Just in the same way as if we followed these 3 stitches up, they come together into a single stitch. So we've just added the 2 that we got rid of over here. And I can demo the double increase one more time because I got 2 of them right in a row here. So I'm going to work another one here just to refresh your memory on that. I'm going to go into the stitch and its corresponding yarn over, do a brioche knit, wait to slide off, bring my needles apart, bring my yarn in between and over, so I'm making a yarn over on my right needle, and then back into the exact same stitch and knit it again, and then slide off. So you can see here I've got 3 stitches coming out of 1, and here I've got 3 stitches coming out of 1. And now I'll work across till I reach the point for my left leaning decrease. Okay, and here I am. You see I have, this is the column of stitches where the left leaning decreases are centered. So I'm going to be decreasing this knit stitch, this purl stitch, and this knit stitch all into one. And this is called a Brioche SSSK because it's a double decrease leaning to the left. And the way you work this one is similar to an SSSK. You're going to take your right needle tip, you're going to slip as if to knit. That's important, not normally like you'd slip to purl, but you're going to slip as if to knit that first stitch and its corresponding yarn over from your left to right needle tip. I haven't worked anything yet, I've just slipped that. And then you're going to do the same thing over on the next stitch. You're going to slip the second stitch as if to knit. This is the purl stitch. Note that it does not have a corresponding yarn over. So I've just slipped 2 stitches knitwise from left to right. Now I'm going to go in and work this stitch as a regular brioche knit. So I'm going into both the stitch and its corresponding yarn over and knitting it. And now I'm going to take my left needle tip, I'm going to go back, and I'm going to pass both of those slipped stitches over the one that I just made. So the first stitch comes over, and then back into the second stitch. Note that that last stitch I'm slipping or passing over is a stitch and its yarn over. And slipping that over. If I pull it down, you can see that I've got 1, 2, 3 stitches leaning left and decreasing down into a single knit stitch. And then I'm going to finish my row. And now we have, I've done 1, 2, 3. This is the 4th row of shaping in the swatch that I've done. So I just placed a right leaning double decrease here to correspond to what I've already have established down here. A left leaning decrease here, which corresponds with what's going on below, and a double increase here and here. And because we did all of those in the same row, my total stitch count's the same, and I'm getting a piece of rectangular fabric that's not growing or shrinking because all the stitches are being accounted for. And so now that you've seen that, I just wanted to show you a couple examples, different examples of shaping in fabric. So here I've got a piece of brioche knitting that's straight. This is a scarf. And very, very much like the swatch that I showed you earlier, because it's straight, but we have slanting lines like this, it means that we have paired increases and decreases. So in this design, we have along this side, if you follow this stitch column, every few rows, you see an increase, a double increase. So this single column of stitches is becoming 3 stitches, 1, 2, 3. And if you follow the knitting across, every time you're working this double increase, you're also working a double decrease to account for the stitches that are being added here and decreased here. So in this case, you see this stitch leans to the right. It follows the line of the shaping. So I've got this stitch leaning to the right. This would correspond to the right leaning decreases that we did in this swatch, and they're worked all the way up. So this is just the pattern repeat for a scarf like this is about 1 inch tall, and you're only working every few rows, you're working this paired increase decrease to get these lines to shape like that. So this is a decorative application where the shaping is used to play with the linear quality of the brioche stitch. And then on a hat, I have a hat here that's worked in brioche stitch, and the shaping is actually used to shape the top of the crown to close it. And in this case, this hat is only using left-leaning decreases. So if you follow this column and this column up, you see how they come together here in a left-leaning decrease, and then this column and this column come together here in a left-leaning decrease, and so on and so forth until this section of fabric shapes down to a single stitch at the top. So you see left-leaning decreases being used only on this top to create kind of a spiral crown shape. So in this case, we have functional use, and in this case, we have decorative use. All the techniques are the exact same. And so if you practice these 3 things, a double increase and then 2 directional double decreases, you can do a whole lot of cool stuff with brioche stitch and have a lot of fun. And that's how you do shaping in brioche.